My name is Shannon Bontrager. I teach history at Georgia Highlands College in Cartersville, Georgia. But we have a couple of different campuses, but I teach at the Cartersville campus. Yep. The Bridging Cultures program that I participated in is a American Historical Association program that they jointly operated with money from the National Endowment of the Humanities. It was a 3-year program. They had 24 participants, teams of 2 from 12 different 2-year institutions from across the country, from Florida to New York. We gathered to talk about how to reinvent the U.S. survey course by incorporating aspects of the Pacific world and the Atlantic world into the U.S. survey. So the first year we went to Pasadena, California, and focused on the Pacific world. And then the next year we went to Washington, D.C. to focus on the Atlantic world. And the third year we presented some of our work at the AHA conference in New York. I decided to redesign the framework of my course because one thing that historians have always sort of privileged is the nation state, a narrative focused on sort of national history. By focusing on bridging cultures of the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds, I was able to decenter that nation-state narrative and focus on many, many kinds of people and cultures and ideas that make up American history. This has been a multi-step process in redesigning my course. Lectures, course assignments, projects, and I did it sort of piecemeal, one at a time. It's hard to do all this at once. But I came up with some original assignments that allowed students to think about different people and places in the Pacific world and the Atlantic world. I came up with some, I think, interesting new assignments that uses the Stanford History Education Group resources. This is something that it's kind of focused on advanced placement courses in high school, but for 2-year schools it's really quite useful too. But it's using documents. It is looking at specific questions about people in the Pacific world or people in the Atlantic world that you can get to help students sort of think historically about the past. So let me qualify what I mean by thinking historically. A lot of times historians teach their classes through what's basically content-driven material. And there's a big push, particularly through a tuning approach to history, to stress content maybe less and to teach more ways to think about the past historically. So tuning is quite important right now for historians as people are trying to get more history majors. People are trying to develop assessment programs that allow them to get money and positions and things like this. So tuning stresses more the skills of what a historian does, thinking historically about the past. And the Stanford History Education Group allows me to sort of do some of those things. So we can think about context. We could think about corroborating sources. We can think about reading the sources very closely, thinking about language and symbols. This is one thing that I've tried to meld with this Pacific approach. So for example, we can look at Lewis and Clark and their expedition. The Stanford History Education Group has a specific lesson plan that deals with, did Lewis and Clark treat Indians fairly or not, Native Americans fairly or not? And they have primary sources from Thomas Jefferson to Lewis and Clark to various others, and it allows the students to then corroborate, contextualize, read closely these documents in order to judge for themselves in a way to answer the question. There are many other sources that can be used to focus on the Pacific world. the Stanford History Education Group website has, I think, over 100 lesson plans. Many of them deal with the Pacific. For example, Chinese immigration, Lewis and Clark Manifest, Destiny, these sorts of things can be used. I also like to use a little bit of Mark Twain's Roughing It. He went to Hawaii very early in his career, and he wrote about his experiences in this book called Roughing It, so you can use that as a primary source. An interesting source is the United States Exploring Expedition, or it's also called the Wilkes Expedition. This was like Lewis and Clark, except it was a naval expedition throughout the Pacific. I think it lasted several years. 7 or 8 ships went and explored the Pacific in the 1830s. They collected artifacts from all the Pacific islands, and that collection became the basis of the Smithsonian Institute. And they have it all online. You can look at the animals that they found. They drew them and tried to explain them, and the people and the languages, and so you can sort of look at this as a first-hand account. So that's kind of interesting to sort of think about early American sort of presence in the Pacific. How my students have reacted to these sources have been pretty. They've liked them quite a bit. I focus on the Philippine-American War a lot in my research, so I bring that into my course. So one thing that I like to use at the Stanford History Education Group is this reaction to the Philippine-American War. They use sources, letters written home from soldiers, congressional testimony. This is a war that was not publicized very well. There were embedded journalists, but their work was censored. So these are very sort of interesting and not well-known sources that we can look at. And students quite like it, particularly when we think about modern issues, wars of empire or expansion or intervention. We can see that in many cases, these men who fought in the Philippines were very critical of the war effort, or particularly a couple letters show the breakdown in authority, the breakdown in communication. Who ordered this massacre to happen? And they cannot necessarily say who ordered it, and you can sort of see that in how things fall apart. Students are very good at sort of translating that into not only thinking historically about the past, but to translate that into current events. So I've had some pretty good feedback from students. It's better than just talking about the war. It allows them to read, to interrogate the sources, and then to come up with their own sort of thoughts about the past. What these sources allow me to do in the classroom is to reach out to many different students and to get them to interact with the past and to sort of do the work that historians do when they're thinking about the past. It's different than a lecture. It's different than presenting content. So, for example, I have an assignment that plays upon this Japanese tradition of pachikucha, which is a very abbreviated presentation format. There are 20 slides, PowerPoint slides. Each slide, you're only allowed 20 seconds. It's on a running timer. So each presentation is 6 minutes, 40 seconds. So you have to really make sure that your ideas are crystal clear and you get to the point quickly. Students, after they do their research and they do a presentation format like this, where they create this presentation and then give it in front of the public. In the case that I did in my class, we invited people from the public to come for a pizza night at a local restaurant, and they presented their work to the public, and they were more than just learning history. They were actually sort of being a historian, presenting their work to the public. And it was original research, a lot of it, even though they were sort of freshmen and sophomore students. So I think they got a lot of understanding about how to be a historian and how to interact with the public, communication skills, research skills. They all got to practice in a very interactive way. The advice that I would give someone who's interested in incorporating a Pacific world sort of vision into their U.S. history course is to just start small. To begin with a lecture or an assignment, to maybe go to the Stanford History Education Group website and pick up just one little lesson plan on maybe Lewis and Clark or Chinese immigration or something like that, something that that you know a lot about, that you would that one would like to give a lecture on, and just sort of ease it into the material. Really, what we're talking about here is shifting focus a little bit. You don't necessarily have to relearn or reconceptualize your course in dramatic ways. You're just shifting the focus. The westward migration, for example, the gold rush of 1848 is not a beginning. It's an ending, so to speak. So you can shift your focus to think about the Pacific world and how it relates to the U.S. But just to begin with something small, something that you like, and to build out from there, I think is the advice that I would give. Some of the sources that I like to use to put into my U.S. survey when I'm focusing on the Atlantic world deal with passenger lists, for example, a lot to do with slave voyages and various other examples. One thing that I like to use, for example, particularly with Puritans, but also people going to Virginia, are passenger lists to compare the kinds of people that are coming over. Usually you find that people going to New England are coming over as families. You can see that in the passenger lists, as opposed to Virginia, where they're usually single men. There's very few women, and students really key in on that. Lord Baltimore had created a shopping list, is what I like to call it as well, and I use that. And he basically tells people what they're basically going to need for 1 year in Maryland, in the New World. And he puts prices, or the cost, in pounds and shillings. And so we add that up in class to sort of get an idea. And it's a pretty big number. When we finish up with it, it's basically something that most of our students would not be able to afford by the time you translate it into modern day dollars. So things like that are very, very helpful to sort of allow students to see sort of the social dynamic of the Atlantic world. I like to also use the Slave Voyages website. I have a project that incorporates the data from this website. David Eltis at Emory University and several others have put this together. It's 35,000 voyages of known slave voyages across the Atlantic. There's also some very interesting essays on this website, and what I like to do is I like to have the students do a social history project where they have to go into the database. They have to find between 30 and 50 voyages, and they have to then count and aggregate data and do averages and things of this nature to sort of get a sense of the slave experience in the Middle Passage. So this is a really interesting website to use. There's many other applications that people could use for this website. This is just what I do. Stephen Barrett has an essay on there that talks about the seasonality of the slave trade. So during certain seasons, more slaves are crossing the Atlantic, and during other seasons, fewer are. Basically dealing with crop rotations and seasonal patterns. So I get my students to find voyages that either sort of corroborate that thesis or sort of challenge it, and then they have to do their own database. They have to represent the data in a graph or some sort of visualization. And so they're doing social history that way, and it allows them to sort of see some of the aspects of the Middle Passage, at least. So those are a couple of ways. The Stanford History Education Group also has, again, focusing on the world and on, specifically for my purposes, the U.S. history, have a lot of sources that they've made available. Lesson plans, nice compact lesson plans that stress historical ways of thinking to get students to practice the skills of doing research, of being a historian, about thinking about the past as a historian would. And several of them can be used in this Atlantic world sort of context. So there's one on the Middle Passage. There is some passenger lists that I was talking about earlier. I get those from the Stanford History Education Group. Pocahontas. So things like this that are maybe sometimes more basic, but also other ones that are more sort of complex. There's many others. If you wanted to move forward to the 19th century, there's some on industrialization, and you can make that work in Atlantic world. Or if you want to go into World War I and World War II, it sort of has several of these lesson plans that can be used in a way to put the U.S. in a larger Atlantic context. So this is a pretty valuable resource, I think, for the purpose I use. It allows you to, what these sources allow you to do is it allows you to sort of get students to break off into groups to do work. There's a lot of writing. For example, there might be a primary source that you can put on the board, and then students will have to write down, look for specific information, like what information could you find in this document that corroborates with this other document that we're looking at. And they have to write that down, and then they have to make they have to have a discussion about it. And at the end of the class, then you've gotten them to actually do the work of research. So it's more than just content, it's actually interactive work for them. This has been received by my students, I think, rather well. I just, for the last semester, although I am trying to implement some of these ideas sort of piecemeal, the last semester I implemented quite a few of the ideas into the entire 16-week schedule. And I have to say that I found that by getting the students to interact and to do the work of thinking historically, they've by and large had really positive experiences, and they've articulated that in various ways, informally coming up after class or in their official sort of student responses. And I've seen the participation level and the grades increase too a little bit. So overall, I think it's been quite helpful. One thing that I let them do this semester, and I think I'm going to do this going forward, is again trying to get them to think historically and to have debates and discuss things. So I let them collaborate on their exams. So we have multiple choice exams, and they basically get to do any format they want. Big, huge groups, so they can work in groups of 3 and 4. And they can't use their notes or their books, but they can use each other. And they have to talk their way through these questions. So some questions will be quite in-depth. It takes them a good maybe 5 minutes to answer some of the questions, because they'll have to read a document and then they'll have to analyze it. And I'll ask the question in such a way that forces them to contextualize the document or to corroborate it with another document, or to sort of ask questions of reliability or credibility, or is this a typical source? Do most people sort of think this? Does this source suggest that this is how most people thought about the past this way or whatever? Anyway, they really, really like that because they can rely on each other, but I found that they talk the entire hour and 15 minutes. It takes them right up to the minute where they are interrogating the sources pretty effectively. So even on that level, I feel that using some of these sources from slavevoyages.org or from the Stanford History Education Group, and then working them into exams. I've seen that they're much more interactive and much more critical, I think. The Bridging Cultures program was a joint effort between the American Historical Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities to create professional development opportunities for two-year faculty from two-year institutions. I was able to participate in that. Specifically, the goal of Bridging Cultures was to revamp the U.S. survey, to focus less on a national narrative or on a traditional sort of political narrative, and to incorporate sort of these hemispheric influences, the Atlantic world and the Pacific world. So each institute, we did this for 3 years and focused 1 year on the Pacific world and 1 year on the Atlantic world. So this is the work that we were doing to reconfigure our survey courses. We use lots of sources to do this. And parallel with that, I've been sort of working on the side with the tuning project to try to take these sort of hemispheric sort of stories and make them more practical in the classroom. So what it's allowed me to do is to get students to develop communication, research skills, connected to history, sort of the tuning aspect, but focused on an Atlantic world or a Pacific world sort of mentality or sort of agenda. And combining the two together, I've been able to sort of revamp my courses, moving away from a content-driven course to more of an interactive course, where students are doing a lot of the work of what a historian does, interrogating sources, trying to corroborate evidence or to contextualize it, trying to read it very closely as a historian would, in a sort of very practical sense that that I think students have enjoyed and have sort of developed sort of universal skills from this.